My name is Red. I'm an alcoholic. Hi. Welcome to you guys in that first 30 or 60 or 90 days. There's no way in the world that I'd ever try to stand up here at a podium and tell anybody in this room whether they're alcoholic. I don't believe I'm qualified to do that. However, if you happen to start identifying with some of these innermost feelings that I'm going to try to describe, some of these symptoms of this terminal disease that I have, I'd sure as hell pay attention. What we're dealing with here is a terminal disease. Just roll that over your tongue a couple of times. That's got kind of a final ring to it. Means that if you continue to use and abuse the mind-altering drug alcohol, and don't let anybody ever kid you that alcohol is not a drug. Alcohol falls right in the drug category with the ethers and the anesthetics. It's one of the oldest known drugs to man. And it's probably been used and abused by man longer than any other drug. And it's probably killed more men and women than any other drug. I used it and abused it over a period of time, regardless of how long it took, until I actually broke my tolerance to it. If you're new on this program and you wonder why alcohol's been giving you so much trouble physically, it's because you've become allergic to the drug alcohol. When old Red drinks alcohol, I break out in spots. Spots like Acapulco, Las Vegas. In other words, once I pick up the first drink of that mind-altering drug, I can no longer predict my behavior. And if you've been having trouble along those lines, I can guarantee you that this afternoon, you're in the right place. This physical allergy that I developed over a period of time to this drug is not necessarily what makes it the killer that it is today. You see, there's a mental side of this disease, and it's the real serious one. It's called the obsession of the mind, and it's triggered, incidentally, by the first drink of that mind-altering drug that you pick up that tells you that this time it's going to be different. This time I'll be able to predict. This time I'll be able to control. This is the time that booze is going to work for me like it always used to. See, if you be alcoholic like old Red and you pick up that first drink, you trigger your obsession to drink. In the alcoholic, it'll immediately set up a compulsion to drink, and you're going to end up, maybe not today, maybe not even this week, but once you trigger that obsession, once you set up that compulsion, you're going to end up in another devastating bout with this mind-altering drug, in which you're just one step closer to the insanity and death that Norm was reading about a minute ago when he read from that portion of chapter 5 from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So the whole idea, the whole concept, if you're new, of the fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous is to teach us on a daily basis how to stay away from that first drink. You know, the first 100 guys and a gal that were on this fellowship that were able to do this successfully, a day at a time for a year, got together and they wrote down what they had done. They called it the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I got to believe that first 100 guys and the gal must have been spiritually led. Because over the last 26 years that Red's been sober a day at a time, I have never found myself in a situation that I couldn't find the solution to in that big book of Alcoholics Anonymous before it was necessary for me to go out there and pick up that first drink. And almost all the answers come in those 12 suggested steps that were read to you this morning. Those are the suggested steps to recovery used by that first 100 guys and a gal that were able to stay sober a day at a time for a year. If you were listening a minute ago when Norm read them, they are suggested steps to recovery. But I can guarantee you that there's not a guy or a gal in a room like this afternoon with any length of sobriety at all that ever had them just suggested to them. You're going to have to take them. You're going to have to do the best you can with them on a daily basis for the rest of your life if you want to become a survivor. Take a look around you in a room like this afternoon, and what you see are the survivors of a terminal disease, a disease from which there is no cure, a progressive disease that's going to continue to get worse for the rest of your life whether you drink or not. If you wonder why Red's standing up here this afternoon still yapping about the same thing after 27 years or 26 years of sobriety, It's because it's a hell of a lot more important for me to stay sober today than it was when I was in that first 30 or 60 or 90 days. Because you see, my disease has continued to progress. I had a very dear buddy with 22 years try it not too long ago. That lady started to drink at 10 in the morning, and by 4 that afternoon she was dead. This is the progression of the disease called alcoholism. I said a minute ago, regardless of how long it took. I say that from podiums around this basin anymore because as I look at these audiences, they keep getting younger on me all the time. Maybe it's because I'm getting so damned old, I don't know. But I know a lot of times youth thinks maybe they got here a little too soon. If you're thinking like that, my God, forget it. The average age of death today of the guy or the gal with a disease called alcoholism is down to 37. Take a look around you. You see a lot of us old jokers still staggering around, so you know how many kids have got to be dying to bring it down to anything like that. It's not extraordinary at all anymore for somebody to go through the gates of insanity and death before their 16th birthday. Coupled with some of that crap that's out there on the street this afternoon, pushing this progression along, it's not hard to pack 20 years of hard drinking into 4 or 5. So if you are in a room like this afternoon, for God's sake, pay attention to some of these symptoms that I'm going to try to describe, some of these innermost feelings, and maybe, just maybe, you might save yourself a lot of hell right here on earth. I'll get off of this bleeding deacon kick and qualify myself as an alcoholic. I really didn't do any drinking at an early age. I had an obsession. I wanted to fly. I wanted to fly the biggest and the fastest airplanes that were ever built. I had a real drawback. I was born back in what they call the Depression years. I know a lot of you aren't old enough to remember them. I have a feeling you might have had a little touch of them in the last 7 or 8 or 9, but, you know, things were tough. I knew my chances weren't that good. I started investigating. It seemed to be my only chance. It'd have to be the military. Except back in those days, we didn't have an Air Force for sale. It was part of what was called the old Army Air Corps. I found to even get into it, I was going to have 2 years of college and a senatorial appointment to the academy. I knew the money wasn't going to be there for that college due to the times, and I was no great student, but I was a big kid. I figured I could do it athletically. I stayed clean all the way through high school. I was out for football and basketball. I won my football scholarship to Colorado State University. I wangled my 2 years of college that way, got my senatorial appointment, and they sent me to what was then called Randolph Field, which was the old Army Air Corps Academy. And they kept me real busy for the rest of my training, and through that period of my life, booze was no problem. I just didn't use it. I graduated as a second lieutenant back in the old Army Air Corps just prior to us getting into World War II. See, a few guys sitting out there this morning can probably remember how unprepared we were for that hassle. You know, our dads were supposed to fight one day in them all, and Congress had never seen too fit to appropriate the kind of a show we've got today. We got tossed into that North African campaign over there against a bunch of guys that had been sitting there practicing for a couple of years, and they'd got pretty damn good at what they were doing. We were strictly undertrained, and we were sure under airplane. I found myself in a situation on that first tour, which a lot of times we were putting up 25 against 200, and we were getting the hell kicked out of us. I came back off of one of those raids very early in that first tour of duty. That particular day, we only got 8 back out of the 25. Now, I think a lot of you can identify with adrenaline, Mother Nature's drug, usually triggered by fear. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. You get a near miss out here on a freeway, you handle her pretty good. You get a half mile down the road, you can't keep your foot on the accelerator. That's adrenaline. And it was pumping. I'd been in an adrenaline type situation for about 6 hours. I was standing in an interrogation line, a room about like this, tables on each side, waiting to go in to talk to them about what had happened. And old Red was shaking. I was shaking to every bone in my body. I wasn't too worried about adrenaline shakes. I'd had them before. You stand there and wait for that football to come down to that 250-pound lineman about to nail you, and you'll quiver. I don't give a damn who you are. But you get in the game and you get over it, and I knew I'd get over it, but this flight surgeon wasn't that sure. He kept looking at me. He says, "What's the matter, Red?" And I said, "Nothing. I'll be all right." He looked at me for a few minutes, and he says, "Young man, I got just what you need." I had never paid too much attention to that medicinal table that they had set up there in operations, but on it they had about a half a dozen open fifths of what they call medicinal whiskey. Think about that for a few minutes. Whiskey is a medicine. Reached over and he picked up a water glass and he poured me about 2 fingers and he said, "Here, drink this." I said, "I really don't want it." He says, "Young man, I prescribe it." Man, I hung on to that one for a lot of years. I picked it up, turned it up, drank it, walked on into interrogation and sat down. If you got an alcoholic personality like I have, I think you know what happened. Man, that stuff sat there and it flowed out there to those fingertips and out there to those toes, and all of a sudden I'm sitting there real comfortable. I looked down and they were roped. 10 minutes before I hadn't been able to light a cigarette or pick up a cup of coffee. 10 minutes down the line with a half a glass of booze, I'm looking at them, they're frozen just like they are this afternoon. Old Red never shook at anything again for the next 20 years. I thought I'd found the luxury of life. I really believed it, and booze worked that well for me for a long time. Even after it started doing to me, it would still do for me. I soon found to get the full benefit out of it, I had to keep recreating the kind of a situation that I'd had that first day. Probably combat's the best adrenaline builder I ever found before or since. I became a combat freak. I stayed 3 years and 2 tours of duty, and I got good at what I was doing. I learned to live on that knife's edge, and I think a lot of you can identify with that fast lane. Booze was always there at the end of the day to handle anything that I couldn't. I used to come in at night, see guys sitting on the edge of their beds worried about going the next day. And I'd look at them and think, God, I wish they could find alcohol. It just never dawned on me that maybe it worked a lot better for me than it did for them. I went right on through World War II. I was back here in the States. I probably should have been able to lay that medication down and go on about my business. But in retrospect, I think I started running into one of the first symptoms of this disease. Some of you might identify with it. It's called justification. Rather than laying it down, I was looking for a job that had some excitement in it. All the real good airplanes, the jet-type airplanes that we got today, were just coming off the drawing boards. They were looking for guys that had a lot of combat experience to evaluate them. I put my application in. I got accepted as a test pilot to the Proving Ground Command. Hell, the excitement was back. I was flying the kind of airplanes now that I'd laid on those Colorado hillsides and dreamt about when I was a kid. I was flying with the best, and I knew it. Booze was still working for me. I think it started working a little bit too well. Proving Ground Command's Eglin Field in Florida. In fact, it still is. They got a big officers club built right out there in the Gulf there at Fort Walton. And I'd catch myself an awful lot of nights hanging out at that club until 2 o'clock in the morning, just kind of tranquilizing the day. And I'd know I had a 6:30 test off. Now, not always for sure. But every once in a while I'd wake up in that BOQ around 11 o'clock with that cold sweat start would come to in. I'd look at my watch and say, did I or didn't I? Pick up the phone and call the sergeant. He said, I give everything written up they wanted this morning. Yes, sir, right down the line. You walk back down to the line, you step up on the wing of that bird, and the knee pad's yours. Checkoffs are yours. Signature's yours. Geolometer says you've been up the speed of sound, and the only thing you can't recall is going. Now, don't kid me that it hasn't happened to you. You step out there on that porch in the morning, that car sitting in the driveway, you say, how did it get home last night? It's called blackout, the overuse and abuse of the mind-altering drug alcohol to the point that it blacks out the conscious mind. If you got any coordination at all, you're going to get by with a hell of a lot of it. I've seen guys go for a week in a blackout, and you never see them stagger, and yet they had no conception of where they were or what they were doing. Should just scare the living hell out of an alcoholic, and I don't believe I've ever found one that it bothered too much. We write her off with the idea that, God, I must have had a good time last night. Willing to take somebody else's word for it. In the occupation that I was in, I knew it wasn't what I was looking for. I started my first feeble attempts, I guess, at control. I'd always been a binge drinker at the end of the day. I figured if I was going to exercise any control at all, I had to string it out over a longer period of time. I think this is how an awful lot of us become daily drinkers. I think what I became over a long period of my life was what I like to refer to as a functioning drunk. I gave up binge-type drinking, but I sure as hell didn't give up drinking. I just strung it out and used it a little more sparingly, and hell, it worked great. Most of the real good airplanes I'd really wanted to test were off the drawing board anyway. I was looking for something maybe had a little more kick to it. As usual, the Air Force come up with it. We found that we'd let way too many guys out right after World War II. They started a big recruiting campaign to get the key personnel to come back. One of the promotional aspects they come up with was the organization of what's still known today as the Air Force Demonstration Team. Probably most of you have seen that team at one air show or another around the country. You don't get sentenced to that team, you volunteer for it. I had all the qualifications. I put my application in and I got accepted. It's not all fun and games. You practice at it 4.5 days a week and you fly 32 air shows around the country a year. They're up to 48 now. But it's an adrenaline-building son of a gun. I was back flying with the best again, and I knew it. Booze was still working for me. I think I started running into another symptom about this time. Some of you might identify with it. It's called hangover. God, I have never found, and this is before or since, a worse place to shake a hangover than an aerobatic formation. You just think about it for a few minutes. You walk out there in the morning, you crawl in that cockpit, and that canopy comes down over you. You're trapped. There's no way in the world you're going to stop at a corner tavern. That's for damn sure. You hook that oxygen mask across your face, and you can no longer become ill. You're breathing through that damn thing. You pull into that 18-inch interval formation, and those guys just insist that you don't shake. You do a lot, and maybe you might identify with this one. It's called the deep sweats. I used to sit there and wonder how come. How come something that's worked for me so well for so long is kicking me around like this? I used to try to analyze it. You know, I got to thinking, hell, maybe it's the life you lead, Red. Maybe at the end of your 2 years, they only let you fly with the team for 2 years. At the end of my 2 years, I'll resign. I'll get out, get in civilian life, get a business going, get a family started. Do the things I'd seen my buddies do. I always believed right up until I had both feet through the gates of insanity and death that given the right set of circumstances, I could control my drinking. I think this philosophy of self-sufficiency that we all grow up with from kids, where every guy and every gal should be an island to themselves, is probably what helps about 14 to 16 million of those practicing alkies that are out there this afternoon self-medicate themselves right out of this world without ever finding what we find in rooms like this, that there is a way out. I finished my 2 years. I resigned. I hit civilian life. All my buddies had been out there about 4.5, 5 years ahead of me now. They'd finished their educations. They had positions. They had good jobs, homes built, families started. If you're anything like I was an alcoholic, you know what you're going to do. Double up and catch up. You know, and this is the way I hit civilian life. I went into business, built a tri-level home, got married, started a family. I think it was a good business. In fact, it's the same kind of business I'm still in today. You guys contributed an awful lot to it in your drinking careers. It's called the auto body business. I think I'd have been all right if I'd have just worked at it 8 hours a day, but I was working 12 and 14 and 16 hours a day. I went to 6 days a week, and then I put on 2 shifts. I got that damn tri-level home down there paid for in a short period of time. I got a trust fund started for the kids to get them through college, and hell, they're only 1 and 3. But this is the way we think, and this is the way we drive. And I'd come through those doors at night so damn beat I could hardly hold my head up. Flop in that easy chair, and there was one thing I could always sell Red on. Man, if there's anything you've earned yourself today, Tiger. And you know what it was a drink of booze, and I was no better off than I was sweating hangovers at 30,000. Strange thing happened to me about this time in my life. Old Harry Truman got his foot in his mouth and sicked us on Korea. I was telling you we hadn't trained any fighter pilots. He found it out, and he had to call the war worries. God, just 21 days from the day I was recalled, I looked out there, I got 2 500-pound napalms nailed to each wing again. They're saying, sick 'em, Tiger. They just went that way. I got another 100 missions to do. You know, I'm 33 years old by this time. Maybe they don't sound old, but it's getting old for a fighter pilot, especially one with a progressive disease. I had no idea that I had a progressive disease. Hell, I was still passing Class A physicals every 6 months. How could I have a disease? But when I started to do that new 100 in Korea, something became quite evident to old Red in a hurry. Those damn missions had got too long between drinks. You know, I think these chains of alcoholism lie so lightly on our shoulders that a lot of us have no idea that they're there until we're completely enmeshed, until all of a sudden we wake up one morning to the fact that we are no longer telling alcohol when we're going to drink it. Booze is beginning to tell us when we're going to drink it. I solved that situation very simply. I went over to the PX and bought myself 2 8-ounce flasks, one for each winter flight boot. And hell, it worked great. I'd use the right one going out and the left one coming home. A long time after booze started doing to me, it would still do for me, and I think a lot of you can identify with that. I think it was brought out very vividly to me just about how hooked I was really getting. Long about my 40th mission, I got it shot up again for about the umpteenth time in my life, and the shell come through the bottom of the airplane right through my left leg, and it kicked it clear into my chin. You know, I still remember getting my foot back down on that rudder, and I could feel liquid running into that left winter flight boot. I still remember sticking my hand down there and pulling her back and thinking, hot dog, it's blood. You know what I thought? I thought they'd shot my coming home jug out. Only an alcoholic identifies with that story. Those of you that have been shot up know damn well what I'm talking about. It'll put you in shock almost immediately, and if you're hooked on a drug, it'll put you in withdrawal about that fast, too. I had an hour yet to get home, and I was damn glad to find my medication still intact. This is the way alcohol was letting me think. I finished my 100. I got back here to the States. I got to thinking, you know, maybe, Red, you could find yourself a flying job far enough away from booze. Maybe there's some place you can get where it's not so readily available. I started looking for that assignment, and they were just starting to build the radar sites up across the Arctic Circle. I went north. If any of you are thinking about that, my God, forget it. The only way those people stay alive up there is to drink booze. I spent a year in Thule, Greenland, where the warmest day we had was 23 below. You know, so cold weather won't do it. It just won't do it. I finally volunteered to come back down to Harmon, pick up the monthly ration of booze for that base up there. Thule's only about 450 miles from the North Pole. I brought down a twin-engine airplane that afternoon. I loaded her clear down with those big 40-ounce Canadian jugs of that CC and VO. And I started back up there that night. I got in one of the damnedest Arctic storms I was ever in, and I lost an engine. It was one of those nights I called Air Sea Rescue, and those bastards wouldn't even come out. And I fought that thing all night, and I got into Thule just at Arctic dawn, and the whole base was down there to meet me. I got to thinking, isn't it great they're that worried about old Red? I rolled back that window, and the first thing they asked me is, you didn't salvo that load, did you? It had never even crossed my mind. I don't know whether you guys had this problem or not. As a daily drinker, I was developing a hell of a smell problem. You know, when you drink booze all day like I did, you begin to smell like booze all day. I got to thinking maybe if I'd get back to Europe where they got that wine on the table and they eat a lot of garlic, that at least I'd blend in better. I volunteered for Fleet Line Service, which is the airline that resupplies NATO. I went back over, and my northern run was Brussels, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Oslo, and Stockholm. Now, those are progressive disease towns, I'll guarantee it. I was picking up a lot of rank over the years, and they kept trying to trap me for command. They finally got it done. They jerked me back here to the States, gave me an air defense group, stuck me up here in Hamilton, just outside of San Francisco. Now I got about 800 men in my command. I'd hear my airplanes roll every morning. It seemed like invariably I'd look out that outer office, and that adjutant of mine would always have about a half a dozen of my boys sitting out there waiting for me to talk to. I found an awful lot of my mornings used to be taken up counseling. These kids had been in town getting themselves into trouble drinking. I had a system. I had an eyes-on safe alongside my desk. Used to keep a 40-ounce jug of Smirnoff Red vodka in there with a hooked glass straw, and every time he'd go out to get one of those boys, I'd hit the safe. Usually by noon, I was giving some pretty damn good lectures on the evils of drink. Also knew that sooner or later I was going to get in a lot of trouble. The Air Force had always been real good to me. I figured I sure as hell owed them a lot more than I was giving them. And again, I decided to resign. This time it didn't work. My resignation got as far as Air Defense Command at Colorado Springs, and they bounced it. Couldn't figure out why a 15-year light colonel all of a sudden wanted to throw his command in. I couldn't very well go in and tell him why. If I had any other terminal disease in this world, I'd have been in there on that doctor's doorstep every morning laying the symptoms on him, telling him, God, Doc, this is where it hurts. But you can take that dying alcoholic, drag him into that same doctor's office, read him that same set of questions. When it comes to that one where it says, do you drink excessively? Oh, a couple of beers now and then, Doc. Self-denial, the greatest symptom of all the symptoms I've been talking about. Our complete lack of our innermost selves to get honest enough to admit that booze has just taken us to pieces. They did let me out. Psychiatry is probably the first help that was ever offered to me as an alcoholic. This was a long time ago. I don't believe that psychiatry can help the practicing alcoholic due to the self-honesty bit. Don't get me wrong, I think that probably anybody in here can be helped by psychiatry. I got to tell you my psych story. It kind of fits in with mine down the line. This guy had an obsession. He had a purple screw for a belly button. Now, he knew it was an obsession, but every time he looked down, there's that bright purple screw right where his belly button should be. He finally goes to this shrink and he says, "Do you think you could help me?" The guy says, "I think I can." He says, "I've got a new potion." He says, "I want you to take it home, get in your best pajamas." He says, "Open your bedroom window, drink this stuff down." He says, "You're going to drift right off to sleep. In will float a little pink cloud. It'll have a little yellow-handled screwdriver on it." He says, "Unscrew that thing, lay it up, let it float out. You get your night's sleep." The guy looked at him and says, "I'm going to try it, Doc." He went home and he went through the routine, and it worked. In floated the little cloud. He unscrewed it, out it floated, got the night's sleep he'd been looking for months. Woke up the next morning completely refreshed. Covers were up. Finally got his nerve up, took a quick look, and sure enough, a normal belly button. He was just elated. He jumped out of bed and his ass fell off. Now, the reason I tell you this story is it's exactly the way that psychiatry worked for old Red. They would fix me up. They would say, "You're fine, Tiger, go get him." I'd jump out there and off it'd fall again. They did let me out. Family has long since got tired of my shenanigans and been on their way. My folks had moved out here to the West Coast, and they'd been real successful. They had a big home over there on the top of Palo Verde Hills, over there behind San Pedro. I figured I'll get up there in that big den with that boob tube and that beautiful view of Los Angeles Harbor. I'm going to kick back, and I'm going to get a handle on this drinking. All the pressures are off. You know, I lasted about 2 weeks up there, and I was going out of my gourd. There was one of these big wooden globes, one of those Columbus-type globes sitting in that den. I kept looking at that thing, and thinking, maybe, Red, you've never taken a true geographic. I'd always been around guys that could cover for me, guys I'd flown combat with or gone to school with. I figured if I'd get someplace in this world far enough away from anybody that knew me, that I'd have to do it on my own. I run my finger up over the meridian to see what was on the other side of the world from Palo Verde. If you want to try it, it's Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. 1 month later, I was flying captain on Ethiopian Airlines. I'm halfway around the world again. Nobody knows Red. All they know is he's got lots of flying time and he's qualified. I gave it my best shot. I don't know whether any of you guys tried white-knuckle sobriety or not, but I stayed sober a year on guts. And if you're thinking about it, my God, forget it. It was the most miserable year I ever spent in my life, before or since. There wasn't a waking moment in that year that I didn't want to drink. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd have to go down to the kitchen and pour myself one, set it on a table and sweat it, not drink it. Prove yourself you got guts enough to leave it alone, Red. I'd go to a movie and I'd have to get up in the middle of it and go to the bar and have the bartender pour me one, not drink it, sit there and sweat it. That's the way I went through that year. At the end of it, I figured, well, there's one thing you proved, Tiger, at least you're not an alcoholic. And I went out to celebrate. It was my last fight. I don't remember fighting after that. You come up that hill, so gradually you hit that level off period and you finally get over on the back side of that alcoholic curve. And I'll guarantee you, once you're on the backside of that curve, you start donating to the pot to reserve your right to use this drug. Usually jobs, securities, homes, things that we worked hard for most of our lives. All of a sudden, you're going to find yourself tossing them into the pot to reserve your right to use this drug. Families, loved ones, people that have stuck by us through hell and high water, all of a sudden we're tossing them into the pot to reserve a right to use this drug. You want to hang out there as long as Red did, you're going to get things like integrity, self-respect, anything that means anything to you. On the backside of that curve, you're going to have to donate. I used to look down and say, if I ever got like that joker, I'd quit. And pretty soon I'd be just like him, and I'd say, I mean that one down there. Down that hill I went. There wasn't too many years before they quit renewing my airline contracts. My reputation was preceding me. In Africa about this time, most of those colonial powers were going independent. I found there was a hell of a demand for the kind of flying I'd been doing most of my life. All of a sudden I find old Red shooting at people for money. This has a funny effect on your insides. I'd always had at least principles to fight for through a couple of wars. Now I'm just sitting there shooting at guys to support a habit that I don't seem to be able to do too much about. There's a lot of other pressures that can be put on practicing alcoholics, as all of you know. You know, I told you I'd been CO of an air defense group that had helped build a radar sites. I'd had a top secret clearance most of my military career. Now I'm flying for a foreign government. You hear things like OSI and CIA, you don't think too much about it, but those bastards are out there, and they can give a practicing alky fits. They know who's paying you, they know how much, they know where you're banking it, they're opening your mail. All those choices away. If you want to hang out there as long as Red did and you live, it's going to do the same thing to you. I kept right on with that kind of a crappy existence until I finally just got so bad they quit hiring me for Red. I was back here in the States. I was 41 years old. I guess I was probably about as unemployable as a guy can get. I figured there wasn't too many things I hadn't tried a couple of times in this world. If I couldn't whip it, at least I could get with it. I bought myself 10 cases of those 40-ounce jugs of that Smirnoff Red vodka, and I stuck them in that hillside over there in Palo Verde. And I went on what was supposed to be old Red's last drunk, and it just damn near it was. That drunk lasted a little over 60 days. The last 30 of it I'd been too sick to eat. People over on the side of that hill had no idea what was the matter with me. I'd been out there among them since I was about 18. They'd never been around me that long. They knew I was getting awful sick physically. You see, this was 26 years ago. It was before detox or care centers or hospitals that would have anything to do with an alcoholic. I think God stepped in about this time. Those people picked a doctor out of the phone book to see if he'd make a house call, and he did. I know today that he didn't do it because of his Hippocratic oath. They happened to pick one that's a member of a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. He listened to those symptoms over the phone. He made the house call, told those people what I was up against, said he'd seen amazing recovery on a program that he himself was trying, said he was going to do the best he could for me physically, and if I asked for help to call you. He thought I was going to die, and they thought I was going to die, so I guess they just called you, because my first recollection of you sober guys were those guys sitting on the edge of that bed. They literally nursed old Red back to health. They started hauling me into rooms like this, and God, I was a tongue-chewing, wet-brained, babbling idiot, I'll guarantee you, for that first 30 days at least. But thank God you read this portion of chapter 5 like Norm did this morning, because I think that's what saved old Red's life. I go to a lot of meetings around the world where they don't do that. But you know, I wasn't capable of hearing too much. I could hear, just don't drink today. And then they'd read those 12 suggested steps. And all of a sudden, one night, sitting at that old maritime meeting over there in Wilmington, it all come crashing in, what I was trying to put together. See, for many years, drunk or sober, the only thing that had ever kept me alive in those complicated airplanes I'd been flying was called a checklist. A list in which everything I had to do to get through one flight was written down. And I'd never gone near a bird in my life, drunk or sober, that I hadn't used that checklist from the time I got up till the time I walked away. And it'd get me through just one flight. Sitting there that night, all of a sudden it dawned on me what 24 hours really is. 24 hours is just one flight in life. And those 12 suggested steps of the checklist of how to get through it without picking up a drink of booze. I've been using that 12-step checklist on a daily basis now for the last 26 years. I've never found it necessary to go back out there and pick up another drink of alcohol, tranquilizing, sedating, elevating pill. Haven't had to smoke any funny grass. I've probably been as close to chemically free as a guy can stay in this modern world. And I owe it all to you guys. See, on my own, I'd given it my best shot, and I'd never scratched the surface. Everything I've been talking about this morning, I've learned in rooms like this. If you got your hand up this morning and you're in that first 30 days and you said, my name is Red and I'm an alcoholic, you pretty well got that number one step nailed. We admit that we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives are unmanageable, and that's just about what we're able to do when we stand up in front of a bunch of our peers and say, my name is Red and I'm an alcoholic. If you're anything like I was, though, when you hit that step number 2, that thing will just shake the living hell out of you. You know, there's a real inference in that step. I'm going to have to ask a power greater than old Red to restore me to sanity. You know, before I can take that step, I got to admit I'm nuts. I got to admit I had to be. Where else would you find a guy completely allergic to a drug that if he continued to use it was going to kill him, that went out there and pumped it down a couple of fifths a day? You know, there's got to be all kind of insanity in us before we come through those doors. Don't let it shake you too much. I'm going to tell you my insanity story. It's about a guy about like I am. I do a lot of yapping for these podiums, and by the time I get my shop closed in Long Beach and get out to Buena Park and change clothes and then double back up to places like this, I'm always driving like a son of a gun to get there in time. This guy was doing the same thing. He only had about 10 minutes to make this meeting he had to speak at. He was on the freeway. His off-ramp was coming up. He thought he had it nailed. Hit the off-ramp, got a couple of blocks down the street, and blew a tire. Went staggered off the side of the road, and sure as hell it's flat. And he thought, well, maybe I can still make it. He run around, jerked his trunk open, got his spare out, jacked his car up, whipped his lug nuts off, put them in a hubcap behind him. He's just setting his spare up. Car come whizzing along behind him, caught the edge of the hubcap, and flipped all his lug nuts right out in the weeds. And he's frantic. He's out there beating these weeds, and it's dark, and he can't find them, and he's wringing his hands, and he knows he's going to be late. And all of a sudden, he heard a voice. He hadn't paid any attention to where he'd rolled to a stop. He looked up, and he's parked right in front of an institution for the alcoholically insane. One of the inmates had been sitting up there on a fence watching all this, and he says, hey, mister. And the guy says, I haven't got time to talk to you right now. He says, I'm in a hell of a hurry. The guy sitting up on a fence says, I've been sitting up here watching you. He says, I figured you must be. He says, hell, if I was in that big a hurry, he said, I'd take the other 3 hubcaps off and take a lug nut off of each wheel, put that thing on there and get going. And the guy stood there and looked at him and he says, that's the answer, isn't it? And he says, yeah. He says, how did you come up with that? I thought you were insane. And the guy says, well, I am, but that's no sign I'm stupid. The point I'm trying to make is this. All of us, when we come through those doors, are a wee bit bent out of shape. We've been out there kicking ourselves around for a hell of a long time. The mere fact that we come looking for help sure as hell proves that we're not stupid. This is where the answers are, in rooms like this. Guys and gals sharing their experience, strength, and hope with each other that we can solve this common problem. I hit that step number 3, and I think all of you know what happened. I run into that word God. I went running for my sponsor, and I said, Mac, is that the God they're talking about? I thought there might be a way around. And he says, yeah, Red. And I said, I haven't got a chance. He's got 250,000 years of book on me before I could even start this program. He says, you didn't read the small print, Tiger. And I said, what's that? He says, a God of your understanding. Now, I had no idea what they were talking about. I was going to have to turn my will and my life over to a power greater than Red. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that there was one right here in front of me. You guys. Group power. I could look in your eyes and I could tell you we're staying sober. The one thing I'd given it my best shot and was never able to do. I started using the group as my higher power. I could believe in group power. Hell, I'd been tucked up in groups all my life. As long as I was in the group, I had all the firepower in the world. Only when I was out there as a straggler, I was going to get my ass shot down. I started hanging with the winners, the guys that had some time on this program. I started listening to them, started picking their brains, and they taught me. They taught me real good about this power that today old Red calls God. My sobriety on a daily basis is a gift from you guys and God. What I do with that sobriety is my gift back to him. You see, let me become part of that pipeline of information started by that first 100 guys and the gal. The only way I can keep it is to keep giving it away. I got to be standing at that door when a new guy comes through. I got to have my hand out and share my experience, strength, and hope with him like they did with me when I come through. This is the fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. I got down to the end of that checklist, and it said, having had a spiritual awakening. And nothing had happened. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that I had no idea what spiritual was. I got to go to a convention about my first 60 days. I heard an old boy from the podium, passed away down there in Laguna a few years back, but he sounded spiritual. He always sounded spiritual every time I ever heard him after that. But I took him aside out of that meeting. I said, come on, tell me about spiritual. And he says, I'm glad you asked, Red. He said, I had a hell of a time with it. He said, I went over to the public library and got the dictionary down. He says, I opened it up to that word and it didn't do too much for me. He said, I got all the dictionaries in the building down. He says, I copied all the definitions and took a consensus. He says, you know what spiritual is? And I says, that's what I'm looking for, something this alky brain can handle. He says, Red, spiritual is that which is not material. Think about that for a few minutes. I started reading that big book of Alcoholics Anonymous real conscientiously to find out why that first 100 guys and a gal put that in there. The more I read it, the more I became convinced of what they were talking about were my attitudes and my emotions. You see, these are the things that had always driven me back out there to pick up that first drink. Alcohol was merely a symptom of what was wrong with me. My attitudes prior to finding you guys, when I'd step out there and take a look at a day, it was, oh God, another day. And they'd been that way a long, long time. What you guys have taught me is to step out there and take a look at her and say, thank God, another day. See, I've been granted one I shouldn't have had. The average age of death when I hit this program was 41. And I told you a minute ago how old old Red was. I was 41. I just barely snuck in. It means that every day that I've been granted, a day at a time over the last 26 years, is a gift from you guys and God. And you can't get too ungrateful for a situation like that. I get up to a podium like this, I get right up on cloud 9. I got to tell you my attitude story. It's about a guy this guy came into a barber shop not too long ago. He was right up on cloud 9. The barber got him in the chair and he says, what are you so happy about? The guy says, I got a 747 reservation going to Rome. He says, I'm going over there and eat some of that good Italian food. He said, I even got an audience with the Pope. The barber looked at him and he says, what's the matter with you, man? He says, that 747 is the roughest airplane in the sky. He says, you'll be airsick all the way over there. He says, you start eating that Italian food and Montezuma's revenge is going to seem mild. He says, you know the Pope isn't going to have time for a commoner like you. Well, the guy had gone in there right on cloud 9. He came out after the haircut right down in the pits, right where those norms usually drop me. He didn't see him for 30 days, and all of a sudden the guy come bouncing back in, and he's really out of sight this time. He got him back in the chair, and he said, what now? He says, I made that trip. He says, that 747 is the smoothest airplane in the sky. He says, there wasn't a ripple going over. He said, I gained 10 pounds eating that Italian food. He said, it was the best I ever had. He said, I even got my audience with the Pope. I got to kneel at his feet, kiss his ring, and he says, would you believe he even had a question for me? The barber looked at him and says, what could he have possibly asked you? He says, where did you get that lousy haircut? Don't let them tear you down. There's no way in the world I can tell you that you're going to get your jobs back, your wives back, your families back, your health back. But I can guarantee you that those 12 suggested steps are going to give you the tools to start digging into that pile of stuff that you brought through the door. And I'll guarantee you that the more you dig, I think the more you're going to start to uncover something that maybe you can live pretty comfortably with on a daily basis for the rest of our time. I still have a hard time getting it right the first time. I don't know whether you guys have trouble with that or not. There's still a hell of a difference between my will and God's, I'll guarantee you that. I heard a story over in Vegas the other night that kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. This guy must have been an alkie. He'd been out of work all during that slow period we had. He finally got himself a real good job in a supermarket in the produce department. He was keeping all the lettuce and tomatoes and vegetables and fruits and everything laid out and wet down and looking good. All of a sudden one afternoon this guy come walking in and he cornered him and says, young man, he says, I want to buy half a head of your lettuce. And the kid looked at him and says, I'm sorry, sir, we don't sell half a heads of lettuce. Now, I deal with the public on a daily basis, and I know how irritating they can get when they want to be. And he wouldn't let up. He says, look at the price of that stuff. He says, I'm a bachelor. It'd just go to waste. Sell me a half a head of lettuce. He stuck with his guns. He says, no, sir, we don't sell it that way. He wouldn't let up. He says, why don't you go back there and ask your store manager whether he'll sell me a half a head? And by this time, the kid is steaming, and I can understand those kind of emotions. He goes charging back into that store manager's office. He says, there's some half-ass character out here that wants to buy half a head of lettuce. The guy had his eyes about this big around, his store manager, and he turned around, and the guy had walked in right behind him. And he says, and this gentleman here would like to buy the other half. See the difference between Red's will and God's, huh? I don't know whether you guys are anything like I was when I hit this program or not. If you're sitting here early looking at all the pretty girls that come into Alcoholics Anonymous, looking for the prettiest one, and your sponsor has said no emotional involvements in that first year, I know the conflict that goes on there. I've been married to the same girl on this program now for 25 years, so you can tell how I was listening to my sponsor when he said that. I was sitting there looking for the prettiest girl in Alcoholics Anonymous, and all of a sudden one night she walked in. And thank God I was hanging on to my old ideas because she was married to somebody else at the time. But she had got into an emotional involvement and hadn't worked out. And we did get together, and those of you who are thinking about that, I don't know whether I'd suggest it or not. You know, you move two chiefs under one roof with no Indians, and I'll guarantee you there's going to be a lot of button pushing going on for a long, long time. But I think the program has allowed us probably to grow up together. And one of the greatest things that it has awarded us, I think, is the fact that we've become friends. You know, and it's very, very seldom that you become friends with the guy or the gal that you're married to. We've had a real good life together. We've gone through a lot of hardships, but we've been active on the program all of our lives. Now, this girl outranks me 3 years and 10 months on this program, and if you're going to get married to another alcoholic, I'd suggest that. Because every time she gets out of line, I say, geez, it seems like anybody with 3 years and 10 months more sobriety than I got would have grown more than that. If I get out of line, I say, give me 3 years and 10 months. I'll be all right. It has been great, though. We've really, really had a lot of luck on this program. We've both sponsored an awful lot of kids throughout the years, and it's been a good life. I still have a lot of trouble. I don't know whether you guys have this trouble or not. I still have a lot of trouble with that turn it over button. You know, it's probably part of my emotional immaturity. You know, when I was talking about attitudes and emotions, in 5 different places in that big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it refers to the one thread, the one trend that seems to run through all our personalities as alcoholics, is a little thing called emotional immaturity. How in the hell could a 41-year-old fighter pilot be emotionally immature? You know, I had a hard time buying that in the beginning. I don't today, because it's probably the one character defect that I've had to work on the hardest. I looked up that word immaturity in the dictionary, and you know what it said? Childlike. My emotions had never grown up. It's brought out very vividly to me every Saturday morning out here in Buena Park, just like yesterday morning. Along about 9 o'clock, there's a knock on old Red's front door. It's all the kids in the neighborhood gathered out there on my lawn wanting to know if I can come out and play. And I do. Every once in a while, my wife comes to the door and they say, oh, it's Red's mother. I could never figure out how I got along with kids so well. I have all my life. I realize today that the reason I always did is because their emotions are my emotions. You see, I had never had to talk down to them. I talked directly to them, just like I'm talking to you, emotional immature jokers, and you know what I'm talking about. Did you ever see one of those little guys get mad? He gets red-faced, fist clenched, drawn back, swinging angry mad. Who does this remind you of? He'll pick up a resentment and he won't talk to the rest of us for the rest of the day. He's going to punish us. Anybody identify him? You know, it's no wonder that we grow up in rooms like this. Hell, some of those kids that's been knocking on that door have been doing it for well over 20 years. A lot of them that I used to put their wheels back on their skateboards, now I'm helping port and relieve their automobiles. And when they got in trouble with that crap that's out there on the street this afternoon, they knew where to bring their buddies and themselves. And I've had a lot of luck in that direction. And I'd have missed it all. I'd have missed it all if it hadn't been for you guys. Like I say, I still have a little trouble with that will bit. I don't have too much trouble turning my will and my life over to the care of God. I have a little trouble leaving it there for any length of time at all. You know, when it starts to get good, guess who wants to take the credit for it? I'd like to close with a little deal that happened to me a few years back down at the shop. I got up one morning there in Buena Park. I had a bunch of situations down there that morning that I really didn't want to go down and handle. I'm still pretty good at procrastination. You know, I hem and hawed around that damn house till I finally hit that 91 freeway going to Long Beach running late. Now, even to this day, when old Red hits a freeway running late, strange things begin to happen. People get cut out, horns get blown, fingers get given. You know, I'm building a head of steam, and I haven't even got to work yet. And whenever I start to act that way, that old monster inside of me, that one that used to whip me right over to that corner tavern begins to lash. I got to run that checklist, and man, I hit that turn it over button, and it's froze in a down position. I haven't turned anything over. I talked to God just like I'm talking to you guys, and I said, okay, sir, you handle it. I'll just go down and do the footwork. I got down there that morning. None of that stuff that I'd anticipated ever did come in. Everything that did come in was just as smooth as glass. It was a nice day. I jumped in that same car that night, headed back out 91 on my way home. Guess who I'm patting on the back for the way I handled that situation? And all of a sudden it dawned on me what I was doing, and I busted out laughing, and I looked over, and the guys driving on each side of me on the freeway are tuning their radios trying to find out what the hell I'm listening to in there. But it reminded me of a story that I used to use back in my combat days about credit, where credit's due. I had 6 clusters to my DFC, and when I'd wear them, guys would look at me and they'd say, "Where in the hell did you ever get those, Red?" And I used to have a stock answer that I got pushed in the pond. But the story goes like this. It's about a Texas rancher. He had one of the biggest spreads in Texas, thousands of acres, big old Olympic-sized pool, big old barbecue area, rambling ranch house. Just as a conversation piece, he built himself about 150-yard across alligator pond. Filled it with the meanest damn alligators he could find the world over, these big old 15-foot snappers. And he didn't feed them too good. He kept them mean out there. All these guys got out there one afternoon drinking his flit and telling these war stories, and this Texan finally got a little tired of him. He says, "I'll tell you what I'll do." He says, "Any of you guys really want to prove your courage?" He says, "Anybody will go down there and swim across that alligator pond, I'll give you my daughter's hand in marriage or $1 million or a ranch like mine." He figured he'd shut him up for good, and he no more turned his back, and he hears all this commotion. He turned around, and here this guy is swimming out across the pond, and he is moving out. He's leaving a rooster tail, and he made it. Texan ran around and helped him out. He says, "I've never seen such a display of courage." He says, "I'll stick with my bargain." He says, "I imagine you want my daughter's hand." The guy shook his head, and he says, "Oh, no, sir." He says, "I'm already married." He looked at him and says, "Well," he says, "then it's got to be the $1 million." The guy shook his head, and he says, "No, sir." He says, "I have an income for life." He looked at him and says, "Then it's got to be the ranch like mine." The guy shook his head, and he says, "No, sir." He says, "My daddy left me one in his will." He looked at him and says, "Well, what do you want?" He says, "I want the name of that son of a bitch that pushed me in the pond." You've been a great audience, gang. Just remember, we all got pushed into that pond of alcohol. Probably no human power could ever got us out of there. God can, and he will, if he is sought. May you find him now. May that power watch over us all a day at a time through the eternity of our spiritual existence. And I sure want to thank you guys for letting me share.